Alright, so this one is going to cover the reality of the first person experience when you're stuck in a porn compulsion, when you're stuck in this cycle of, porn addiction. If you do struggle with compulsive behavior around porn, my intention and my hope is that this video helps expand your awareness of the situation that you're in, and that it hits home and it feels relatable. I like this video to be something that you can rewatch and even listen to in the background as a form of mental rewiring. And if you're struggling with stopping porn, I want this to bring more clarity and some reassurance that you're certainly not the only person in this situation. So for any new viewers, I'm Joe. I had a 17-year porn compulsion, and so I was actively trying to stop for 9 of those years. During that time I used NoFap, meditation, self-improvement, all the stuff that we typically try when trying to stop our behavior with porn. On top of this, I also went through 2 paid recovery programs, and despite all of that, I didn't get the result that I wanted. Actually stop the behavior and stay stopped. And so that all changed when I met Mary Paulus and Tom Molyneux over at Beyond Compulsion Academy, and it turned out to be the right one for me. And so subsequently I was able to stop the behavior finally, and their method is based on rewiring neural pathways, embracing discomfort of urges in the correct way, and really facing the problem from a position of strength. And so now I'm here doing the same thing that they're doing, connecting guys with what worked for me. And so a lot of what I'll cover in this video comes from my own lived experiences, as well as the experiences of over about 100 clients, co-clients that is, which I've seen firsthand while being part of all these programs I've been on. And now being involved with BCA, there's now even more points of reference to sort of point at. And so the goal of this video is to highlight these concepts, put them out there and make them relatable. I'll also do my best to clarify what's actually happening in the mind, so you can leave this video with a bit more clarity after having been through the training, learnt the concepts, and sharing all these lessons with you. So just to get straight into it, the first thing that I want to clarify here is the concept of dopamine and neurochemicals, because this is a big topic within the space, and I want to sort of make this first premise before I move on. And so the first thing I want to unpack here is the idea around neurochemicals, especially dopamine, and how it relates to stopping a porn addiction, how to stop a porn compulsion. The main point that I want to make here is that if you're focusing too heavily on dopamine and neurochemistry alone, it will only take us so far when it comes to actually putting these principles into practice in order to stop the behavior, in order to stop the addiction playing out in your life. Because the issue in this space is that there's a lot of emphasis placed on the physiological side of addiction. Things like, the cocktail of neurotransmitters that get released when somebody engages in porn, and how high levels of stimulation over an indefinite period of time can lead to a compulsive behavior. And while all that information isn't wrong, when we focus too much on the tuning and the tweaking of dopamine levels in our lives, we often end up missing what's actually happening in our lived first-person experience when we're actually in the addiction cycle. And when you're actually in that state, there's actually a lot going on internally, which we do experience and we do notice, but it seems that a lot of it gets sort of not talked about or sort of slides under the radar when it comes up in conversations. And so we want to sort of highlight this today. So when you're in that addiction, there are a lot of thoughts constantly whizzing around, and those thoughts inevitably trigger different feelings. From those feelings you enter a very specific mental space, one where the inclination to engage in porn starts to feel very compelling, and that sort of tension starts to build within you. And this is where the dilemma appears, right? Do I engage? Do I not engage? There's this mental back and forth going on. Glamorizing thoughts might pop up. You might start thinking about scenes that you've seen before when previously watching porn. And very often this is where most people sort of panic because they're in the peak of that urge. I was certainly one of those. And feeling that intense sense of wanting, that strong pull towards the compulsive behavior, or at least to engage in the compulsive behavior, to engage in porn basically. And so it's fair to say that this is a moment of critical importance. It's a critical moment. This is the point we actually need to be prepared for. So while understanding the neuroscience and the physiological process can be helpful, it's only a adjacent part of what's actually happening when we sort of take that zoomed out view of the whole situation. And so if we want to resolve the mental conflict and actually stop the behavior, we need to go beyond the dopamine explanations and start paying attention to what's unfolding in real time in the first person, inside our thoughts, our feelings, and the moment to moment experience that we all are locked into when we're in an addiction. I think one instance of this concept was a video that came out recently by a very popular medical YouTuber, and I think I'll post a thumbnail of the video. And although again the information in that video regarding the physiological processes, the neuroscience behind watching porn and what happens, although all that is accurate sort of information about what's happening, it's not actually dealing with the rest of the equation, all the thoughts, all the sort of feelings, all the experiences within the first person of addiction, rather than focusing on levels of dopamine, these neurochemicals, all these other factors. It's critical that the rest of it does get addressed rather than just focusing on these neurochemical processes. Alright, so the next concept I want to talk about as a sort of premise here is the role of addicted neural pathways in withdrawal. So this section is placed right at the start of the video on purpose because it sets the premise for everything that's about to follow. And so the concept of addicted neural pathways is a level of understanding that actually gives us strength in this situation. It boosts confidence and it allows us to see that with a good system, these pathways can change due to neuroplasticity. And so when you understand this properly, stopping and staying stopped becomes possible without this addiction feeling like something that you have to constantly fight. I hear a lot of language around porn addiction being this sort of beast to tame, or a battle or a war, for example. And I was in this sort of view of seeing it as a battle or a beast. But in reality, once you understand addicted neural pathways and how neuroplasticity plays a role in this situation, it's not as big or as overwhelming as it is made out to be. It doesn't matter whether you've been engaging for a few years or whether you have been gooning for hours every day for the past 30 years. The principle stays the same. The mechanism stays the same. There isn't a different type of dopamine involved. It's not determined by your personality type. The first principle is consistent, and that means it's something that we can unpack, understand, and work with. When addicted neural pathways enter that withdrawal period, so when in a porn addiction you enter that period of withdrawal, the first sort of 2 weeks, we're all kind of accustomed to that situation. The experience can feel intense, but this is not a sign that something is wrong. It's actually a sign that something is changing within those moments. And before going through coaching within BCA at the start of 2025, the concept of addicted neural pathways wasn't completely unknown to me. I already understood neuroplasticity, as most of us do, how the brain adapts, how patterns form, and how repeated behaviours shape the way we think. What changed in BCA was the depth of understanding around the first person experience of withdrawal and how to navigate discomfort urges and the mental turbulence in real time, and why these sensations show up in the first place. And once that clicked, it felt like I suddenly had this mental map. Instead of being confused or alarmed by what was happening internally, I could orient myself within that experience. When addicted neural pathways are no longer being fed, they don't just disappear quietly, they do push back, which is expected. The pushback shows up as urges, it shows up as discomfort, restlessness, emotional noise, and a sense that something, feels off. This is withdrawal, and it is supposed to happen. So the mistake people often make is measuring progress with how many urges did I have this week, or whether urges are still showing up at all. And this is the wrong metric. Urges doesn't mean that you're doing bad or that you're failing. And discomfort certainly doesn't mean like a regression, depending on the context, of course. What actually matters is whether you're able to follow a framework that allows you to stay present with the discomfort without reacting to it in a negative way, to let the urges rise and fall without acting them out, which is what we all know. We just need to ascertain the right strategy in order to be in that space, right? And that's the work withdrawal is asking of you. So if you're experiencing withdrawal, it's not a problem to fix. It is a phase to move through. And progress is certainly not defined by an absence of urges, especially within the withdrawal period. It's defined by your ability to meet the temporary discomfort with the right response consistently. When you understand that, withdrawal stops feeling like this threat. It stops feeling like this thing that you are programmed to panic around, if that makes sense, and starts feeling like a process that you can successfully navigate. Alright, cool. So the first sort of concept that we're going to cover right now is the omnipresence. So when you have addicted neural pathways, the experience of addiction is that it feels ever present. It's always there. Hence, omnipresent. Mary over at BCA talks about this point very clearly. Being in an active addiction is essentially being in a full-time job. You don't just feel the impact during the act of engaging in the addiction, you feel it outside as well. You certainly feel it outside of those times of engaging as well, through the mental conflict, the lost time, the lack of sleep, and everything that comes with that knock-on effect. And so over time, this constant internal conflict really starts to wear you down. Years and years and years of wearing you down with this constant conflict of feeling like the addiction is always there to stick around and I don't miss it. The paradigm that you're stuck in feels very heavy, feels very sticky, feels very hard to escape, like it just won't let go. And I remember very clearly around the middle of 2024 when things were sort of piling up, the way that they often do in life in general. That familiar heaviness was there, that mental residue from engaging, just sitting there on my mind. I remember thinking that, what am I not seeing here? Why is this something that I can't figure out? Like I've been engaging for years and years and years. So many tries to stop and it's still here. Like, what is it that I'm not seeing here? And it was incredibly sort of frustrating, and that ongoing conflict starts to form a kind of filter over your point of view. It sits in the background of everyday life when you're doing normal tasks and when you're socializing, when you're working, it's always there, it's always in the background. And it's something that you'd much rather not be there. It's something that you much rather not have occupying your mind at all. And so to have that feeling removed, to have it no longer hold power over you is a really critical shift that you want to go through. And with the right training, that shift can happen, the paradigm can change, and you're no longer held down by that constant dark cloud hanging over your experience, right? All right, the next common one, second guessing. So second guessing yourself. Second guessing yourself is a big one, and it's extremely common. And more importantly, it makes, total sense why we sort of end up in this space when we've tried so many times to stop. When you've been taking loss after loss inside a relapse cycle, those experiences do inevitably stack up, and when you have addicted neural pathways, it almost feels inevitable that those losses will start to affect you. On top of that, there's the constant mental conflict we've already talked about, keeping you stuck in that rut, spiraling through negative thoughts, and from there the addicted part of the mind starts to invoke those feelings of hopelessness, which is a key strategy of addicted neural pathways to keep you in that space. Because the number one goal of the addicted part of the mind, the number one goal of those addicted neural pathways, is to get you into a mindset where you're more likely to engage in porn, more likely to engage in any of your compulsive behaviors. And so you can expect this kind of mental activity to show up again and again and again. And this really hits hard when you're stuck in that streak mentality. So with the nofap streaks and all of that stuff, you end up, building up a number of days, and then when a relapse happens, that loss feels really heavy, and that's why I'll never count days again. It's just simply the wrong sort of attitude to sort of attack the problem from, and we can get into that. And so that moment often triggers even more negative thoughts, which in turn then leads to the feeling that you cannot trust yourself anymore. And that makes total sense. And from there, second guessing yourself becomes almost automatic, and it's hard to not second guess yourself in that position. So if you find yourself constantly second guessing yourself, know this: it makes total sense why you're in that position. This is 100% expected experience when you have addicted neural pathways. There is nothing wrong with you for feeling this way. It's just part of how the addiction keeps itself alive, how it keeps itself going. Expect it. Next up, we have flat victories. Another common experience in addiction is what I like to call flat victories. So when you're in an addiction, even when a lot of good things are happening, when you achieve something, you don't feel the level of joy or enthusiasm or satisfaction that you would expect to feel. And the reason for this is that you're not experiencing life from a neutral or grounded baseline whatsoever, and you're experiencing it from a place of constant mental conflict. Now, a lot of this, again, gets attributed to neurochemicals and dopamine. Although it may contribute to a low mood state, this is a lot more deeply rooted than when you're in this situation on a mental level. And so when a large part of your mental and emotional energy is getting consumed by urges, self-conflict, and the internal pressure, there's simply less capacity left to fully register positive moments. And so the system is sort of already overloaded at this point. Even real wins don't land the way that they normally would. You might hit a milestone at work, in the gym, or even socially, or in some other personal goal, and on paper it's a win, it's a W, but internally the response is pretty muted. There's no real sense of fulfillment, there's no feeling of this landed, and so instead there's a kind of emotional flatness, or even a background awareness of the addiction still sitting there underneath it all. The win happens, but the mind doesn't really allow you to feel it. So if your victories feel flat, that doesn't mean that you're ungrateful or you're broken. It's a sign that ongoing mental conflict within the context of a porn addiction is dampening your emotional range. The conflict, and as the conflict resolves, the ability to actually feel satisfaction again and joy returns naturally. Eventually you get more enthusiasm, and it sort of undoes all that bad programming that we've inherited over the years of engaging. Next one, a big one: non-deservingness. So non-deservingness is a huge one, and it's incredibly common. It's a feeling that because you're still relapsing, because you're still experiencing the negative consequences of engaging in porn and spinning up those addicted neural pathways, you somehow feel that you don't deserve good things in life. And This sort of makes even more sense if you've been trying years and years and years to stop your porn habits, your porn addiction. You feel that because you haven't moved on from this area in life, that you haven't moved past this sort of chapter in your life, that you don't deserve other good things because you haven't done the work to overcome this bit yet. And this gets a lot of guys trapped, and it's not a good place to be in. And it's certainly irrational. When this is happening, a lot of self-deprecation starts to creep in, and we'll touch a bit more on that later. This particular type of self-deprecation is especially insidious because it slips under the radar. It doesn't always show up as loud self-hate. Instead, it quietly compounds and starts affecting other areas of your life. You begin to internalize the idea that because you haven't figured this out yet, there must be something fundamentally wrong with you. And I certainly felt that on a certain level as well, and it's not great. So you've been trying to stop for years and you find yourself stuck in the same relapse cycle. And a new year comes around and you start telling yourself that something is wrong with you, something is wrong with your desires, something is dysfunctional about you as a person. And of course, this is just the addiction talking, but without awareness, it really doesn't feel like that. It feels very real. And this gets amplified when you see people around you, whether it's online, offline, saying that they don't have this problem, or that they stopped easily, or that it just wasn't hard for them to stop. And that comparison deepens the belief that you are the problem. And believe me, this feeling is extremely common, certainly among a lot of guys who I've been through programs with. I've also attested to this. So again, this is totally expected when addicted neural pathways are in play. There's nothing uniquely wrong with you. It's absolutely, again, expected to feel this way. Well, next one is over-analysing behaviours. So over-analysis of behaviour often becomes counterproductive, turning reflection into this sort of compulsive loop that creates confusion rather than clarity. So for example, if you relapsed, you might attribute it to something that happened in your social life, or something that happened when you're eating something, which might spike a level of some neurochemical or some hormone, and you attribute your relapse to that action. The rule here is that you know what's reasonable when it comes to your behavior in general. And so this happens because the mind, when faced with discomfort or a relapse, tries to restore a sense of control by constructing explanations. So the addicted part of the mind is back in control. It's trying to spin up this convolution with all these matters happening. And instead of tolerating uncertainty, it scans unrelated areas of life, such as diet, productivity, habits, for causal links. The analysis feels responsible and even insightful, but it's largely post hoc storytelling. And so as complexity increases, usefulness absolutely decreases also, and reflection quietly shifts into a lot of rumination. So for example, you might start thinking, I ate X food today, which affects Y hormone, and so that must explain why I relapsed. Or perhaps it was something like, I was off task with my business goals on the weekend, so laziness must be creeping back in and pushing me towards these more less useful behaviors. And so each thought may sound plausible in isolation, but together they form an ever expanding web of explanations that don't actually guide action. And so the person becomes hyper aware of every choice, hyper analyzing each one of those choices, interpreting normal human variance as evidence for deeper flaws. And so despite all this analysis, they're left with no closer understanding. When reflection turns into this form of self-surveillance, it stops becoming a tool for growth and becomes another avoidance strategy, which is absolutely something that we don't want. Real progress usually comes not from more intricate explanations, but from simple, applied first principles. And so again, the rule here is that you know what's reasonable when it comes to your behavior. All right, we're on it here. So self-deprecating thoughts. Self-deprecating thoughts are another very, 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 very common experience when you're dealing with a porn addiction. They show up as that inner voice that constantly criticizes you, puts you down, and questions your worth, especially after a relapse or periods of struggling with porn. And so these thoughts don't come from nowhere. They're closely tied to, that repeated loss that you normally take, the disappointment, and the ongoing mental conflict that addiction generally invokes. And so when addicted neural pathways are active, the mind is under pressure to resolve that conflict. And so one of the ways it does that is by turning inward, framing the problem as you being the issue rather than the pattern. And so over time, that creates a habit of self-criticism that almost feels automatic and very convincing. You might notice thoughts like, I should be past this right now. Other people don't struggle like this. What's wrong with me? These thoughts often show up quietly in the background and be there when you wake up, when you're trying to focus, or right after you tell yourself you're going to do better next time. And because of addiction, and because the addiction enables you to believe that it's in the driver's seat, these thoughts are easy to believe, even though they're being generated from that addicted mental state. So if you're noticing self-deprecating thoughts, that doesn't mean they're true, of course. That goes without saying. It means that addicted neural pathways are still active and they're looking for leverage, and learning to recognize these thoughts for what they are, a symptom that is, rather than taking them at face value, is a key step in reducing the power it has over you. So the next one is a big, big one. It's feeling spiritually compromised. So this one hits especially hard for people who are religiously inclined, and even more so for those who are in positions of leadership and responsibility within their community. But it's important to say this clearly: the damage is no less potent for those people who aren't necessarily in leadership roles but fall into this category, and we'll get into this a little bit. When the addiction intersects with faith, morality, or spiritual identity, the internal conflict very easily deepens. So instead of the struggle being framed as a behavioral pattern or a mental process, it often becomes framed as sort of a moral failure or a reflection of someone's character. And that all adds another level of shame, secrecy, and self-judgment on top of the symptoms of the addiction that are already happening. And so that weight definitely compounds, especially when you feel that you're supposed to be sort of this shining example for other people. And again, there is a sort of irrational component to that, but we'll get into it. And so for an example, a Christian might think, how can I claim to follow Christ and still be doing this? And a Muslim might think, well, how can I pray, fast, or submit to Allah while I'm stuck in this behavior, right? It's the same internal conflict. And when someone is also a leader or a mentor or a respected member of the community within this paradigm, that conflict definitely intensifies, and for good reason. Fear of being exposed, the feeling of hypocrisy, pressure to appear spiritually aligned, all feed into this addiction cycle. Rather than resolving it. So if this struggle feels heavier because of your faith or values, know this: you're not uniquely broken, you're not weak, and you're not an immoral person. This is just what happens when an addiction hijacks your system. This is what happens when an addiction is in the driver's seat. This is what happens when an addiction is in control, that's deeply tied to identity. Understanding that distinction is real and it's crucial, because resolving the behavior requires a certain level of clarity. You need to step back a bit and look at the situation from a sort of top-down view. It's so essential here to really separate the behavior from yourself in terms of your human value. Really understand that you're in this situation where The addiction is a separate temporary entity. It's a separate temporary state that can be stopped given the right training. And by all means, absolutely ask God for help. Focus on the priority at hand, which is to stop your compulsive behavior, with porn in this case, and stay stopped by taking that consistent action. Comparison fatigue. Comparison fatigue is a real painful part of addiction. It's what happens when you repeatedly measure yourself against other people and come away feeling, behind, defective, or even lesser of a person. When you're stuck in an addiction, when you're stuck in the porn addiction cycle, your mind is already under that constant pressure, and comparison adds another level to that strain, so to speak. And so you're not just dealing with urges or relapse, you're also tracking how everyone else seems to be doing better, progressing faster, or struggling less. That constant comparison drains energy, reinforces shame, and keeps your attention sort of locked outward instead of inward where it needs to be. And of course, staying in the present moment. And the addicted part of the mind uses this perfectly. It turns comparison into proof that you're failing. You see other people online saying that they quit easily, and this is rather exclusive to places such as the NoFap Reddit. You hear others talk about long streaks or total freedom. You watch other people move forward in life while you sort of feel stuck in the same loop that you have felt stuck in for the past 10 years, let's say. And so the conclusion hits pretty fast. Why can't I do what they did? What's wrong with me? That repeated comparison ends up not actually motivating you. It exhausts you. It leaves you mentally drained and discouraged and more inclined to keep relapsing, which is all part of the cycle of having addicted neural pathways, of course. So if you're feeling worn down, discouraged, or defeated by comparing yourself to others, and I was in this boat, of course, that's not a character flaw. That's a comparison fatigue doing exactly what it does best, stripping you of clarity, adding momentum to the shame, the guilt, the rest of the emotions that we're all very used to. Stopping porn certainly doesn't come from a place of measuring yourself against other people. It comes from stepping out of that comparison entirely and focusing on your own process, moment by moment, intentional focus. Okay, the revolving self-improvement door. Now, I was deep in this at one point. The revolving self-improvement door is another particularly insidious pattern. So it's what happens when you're doing well in life, improving, growing, leveling up, whatever you want to call it, yet the wanting for porn doesn't go away. And it shouldn't, because of what we know about addicted neural pathways. But when you're not aware, you don't know, and the story ends up something like this. And so the addiction stays active, relapse continues, and the mental conflict remains in place. When this happens, morale can go completely haywire, as in it sinks to the bottom of the ocean like a rock. What makes this so confusing, however, is that self-improvement, it does bring real benefits. You might be building skills, confidence, discipline, or momentum in other areas of your life. But when porn addiction is still present, when you're still relapsing and still stuck in that constant mental conflict, all of that growth doesn't necessarily transform into relief. The disconnect creates a frustration and a feeling of hopelessness. In the online self-improvement space especially, there's this sort of common narrative: stay busy, eliminate free time, keep improving so that you won't want to watch porn anymore. But addicted neural pathways are built over time. If they're not actively rewired and worked on, if they're not actively being rewired, if we're not actively trying to proactively target them intentionally to rewire them, the brain will continue to want porn regardless of how productive or disciplined we become. you work harder, you push more, you double down on routines and goals and progress, yet the addiction doesn't budge. The urges are still there, the discomfort is still there, and relapsing still happens. And that's when the hopelessness ramps up, because now it feels like you're doing everything right and you cannot shake the behavior still. Neuroplasticity in this scenario isn't working in your favor. The addiction has already been established, so that needs to be dealt with separately. More self-improvement, while absolutely beneficial for life in general, no doubt, does not by itself rewire an addicted brain. Some people might label, targeted programs such as BCA, right? They might label it as self-improvement, and that's totally fine. But the difference is the strategy. One approach directly targets the addiction and its mechanisms. The other, such as, fitness or working on your social skills, is indirect, and so hoping to fix two things in one go, to hit two birds in one stone, doesn't work effectively in this scenario. It doesn't stop the wanting for porn. Most of us have actually tried this, and it keeps us looping back and forth, spiraling, repeating the same cycle. And so here's the good news. There's nothing wrong with you. You're just doing self-improvement. And if you're doing self-improvement right now, keep doing it. It matters, but just don't expect it to stop a porn addiction just by doing self-improvement. Stopping pornography requires direct, intentional action aimed at the addiction itself. Make that separation now, and everything will, God willing, become a lot more clearer. Okay, so next up, something I personally experience: lack of enthusiasm. So a lack of enthusiasm is another very common experience when you're stuck in a porn addiction. We touched on this a bit earlier, of course. So it shows up as a flatness towards life in general, a reduced sense of interest, motivation, or excitement, or even around things that matter to you. This doesn't happen because you've suddenly become lazy or unmotivated. It happens because a large part of your mental energy is being consumed by internal conflict, when the mind is constantly managing urges, resisting, bargaining, or recovering from that sort of fallout from a relapse. There's less space for genuine, engagement in life. Over time, that mental ongoing strain really blunts enthusiasm, not because life is necessarily empty, and again, like this whole meaning, searching for meaning, having a purpose in life, it really doesn't come into any sort of play here. It's simply because your attention, your mental energy, your emotional energy is tied up somewhere else. So you might notice that plans don't excite you the way that they used to. Goals feel very distant. Even things you enjoy may feel a bit muted or effortful to actually carry out. And you still show up, you still function, but internally there's a sense of going through the motions. And often there's confusion layered on top of that. Why don't I feel more motivated? The confusion that quietly turns into this form of self-judgment, which only adds more pressure. So if enthusiasm feels low, it's not a personal failure. It's a natural consequence of sustained mental conflict from addicted neural pathways to pornography. As that conflict resolves, enthusiasm returns on its own, not through force or like hype, right? But through relief and added clarity. So the next one, accountability partner misconception. And I want to address accountability partners briefly because they can unintentionally put you in a weakened mental position. They can create the belief that your ability to stop porn is partially dependent on someone else. And this is coming from someone who had accountability partners, who was assigned them, who worked with them, someone who originally thought that they would be very beneficial. And yeah, sure, they're great for connecting with other people who are in your situation, but it's not necessarily a solid move when it comes to stopping pornography use and staying stopped. And when your success is framed as contingent on outside monitoring or support, you're subtly conceding that you cannot do this on your own. And while support isn't, inherently bad, as I just mentioned, recovery built on dependency undermines the most important shift of, the first principles, recognizing that with the right mental framework, you already have the strength and capacity to stop the behavior with porn. Now, if you feel calmer only because someone is checking in on you or more anxious when support is removed, then the center of control isn't internal, it's external. And this is where the problem lies, right? That keeps your confidence conditional, and the conditional confidence won't hold under pressure. So the goal isn't to avoid support, it's to stop outsourcing your strength and power. So with the right framework, the ability to overcome porn addiction becomes how you respond internally, not from who is keeping track of you, who is watching you. That's where the real lasting change will happen. All right, so we're now on to unanswerable questions. So unanswerable questions, UQs for short, are a concept that only BCA so far has included in the curriculum, if you want to call it that. And it is an essential skill to deal with them when they come up. Unanswerable questions are subtle but powerful tactic by the addicted part of the mind, especially during withdrawal. They're designed to pull you into an endless string of internal questioning, not to find clarity, but to destabilize you when you're on that straight line. What these questions do is they keep you locked into this internal dialogue, questioning, analysing, and second-guessing yourself, as we mentioned earlier, until you eventually land in a state of confusion or helplessness. From that confused position, the mind becomes far more inclined to fall back into a pattern of addiction, engaging back into porn, engaging back in the cycle. So this pattern flies under the radar usually because these questions often sound deep, insightful, or even philosophical, but their function isn't insight, it's erosion of certainty. And here's the key point: if you're questioning whether you want to engage in your compulsive behavior, that means the wanting is already there, that you are wanting to engage in your compulsive behavior, you are wanting to engage in porn. And so the questioning here becomes a signal. A common unanswerable question might sound something like this: can an addiction ever really be cured? And then the back and forth then begins, right? So it sounds something like, what if this never fully goes away? What if I'm always going to have urges? What if I'm just managing this forever? What's the point of resisting right now if it's always going to be there? And so at this point, the mind feels really stuck, uncertain, and fatigued, as you'd expect. You're no longer grounded. You're analysing your way into doubt, essentially. And from that position, engaging in the addiction starts to feel like, a relief from the mental noise itself. And this is where the trap happens, right? So the move here isn't to actually answer these questions, it's to simply recognize them. Unanswerable questions don't need solutions, they need disengagement. When you notice yourself questioning in this way, the work is to return straight back to the framework, stay with the discomfort, and stop feeding the dialogue. Clarity doesn't come from thinking harder, it comes from stepping out the loop sometimes. So if any of the points today that I've been describing here resonates with you, especially the way that I've talked about addicted neural pathways, mental conflict, and navigating urges from the first person experience, then it might be worth you taking a closer look at BCA, Beyond Compulsion Academy. That's where I personally got the clarity and structure that helped me stop, and most importantly, stay stopped. There's no pressure here. Again, it's just information. If you're curious, explore it at your own pace and see if the framework aligns with where you're at. At the very least, you'll come away with a more clear understanding of what's actually going on, and sometimes that clarity alone is the first real shift in awareness. And I'll link a good video that Tom made and see if you find it useful. Give that channel a watch and you'll definitely benefit from it. Click on the link in the description to take you to the addiction quiz. From the results, you'll know whether you have a compulsive behaviour with porn or not. You don't have to opt in for further interest in BCA, and we'll just send you over the test results to your email.